Welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. This month is a really interesting book. I'm excited to speak with you about it. It's called Making Numbers Count, The Art and Science of Communicating Numbers. And before getting into the book in too much detail, I'd love to share a couple of examples, learning points from the book this way. Which is more impactful? The first way of communicating this statistic, this number, or the second way? Okay. Example number one. In terms of economic prowess, California leads all other 49 US states in gross domestic product. If California were a freestanding country, it would be the fifth largest economy in the world. First example. Second example. The chances of something happening is 1,000,000 to 1. And the second way I might explain that is if you go to the library to where the Harry Potter books are, and you remove the second book, so you've got book 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 looking at you. You take out one of the books, you go to a random page, you circle a random word, and you put the book back in the library. Somebody else comes in behind you, they're looking at those same 6 books. The chances of them opening to the same book on the same page and circling the same word are 1,000,000 to 1. That's the second example. Third example. Modern humans first appeared 200,000 years ago, a very recent addition to the universe, because the Big Bang occurred an estimated 13.8 billion years ago. That's the raw numbers. Could explain it this way. Suppose the history of the universe spanned the 24 hours of a single day. The Big Bang happens precisely at midnight, the very beginning of the day. For a long time, nothing happens. 12 hours pass, then 16 hours pass. At about 4:10 p.m., our sun comes to life in the midst of a cloud of dust, and the planets start forming around it. 5 minutes later, the Earth appears and begins to cool. Single-cell life appears on Earth by 5:30 p.m. Vertebrates don't arrive until around 11:09 p.m. of this one day of the Earth's history. Dinosaurs and the first mammals appear around 11:37 p.m. T-Rex shows up at 11:52 with 8 minutes left in the day, but disappears when an asteroid hits a minute later. The entire history of humankind doesn't even take up the final second. So I love these examples as a way of demonstrating the value of communicating numbers in different ways. From my point of view, the second way of communicating these examples is so much more compelling. Whether you're talking about a category jumping thing, like comparing the California economy to a country, or you're translating 1 in a million to something you could really understand, namely that these depth of the Harry Potter books, because those 6 books have 1,000,000 words in them combined, or humankind's history on Earth as described through the lens of a single 24-hour day. And where does human history fit? Doesn't even take up the final second. I think just now I understand what that means. Whereas before, so what we're talking about today in the book club is the book, as I mentioned, Making Numbers Count, The Art and Science of Communicating Numbers. My focus in reading this book myself and then in sharing this book in this forum is considering how it can help people, particularly people in business, how to be more effective. How can they advocate better? How can they help other people understand the impact of their decisions, or even what we're arguing about? Are we talking about the right statistics? Which statistics and which numbers are most important for us to be discussing? How can we more effectively speak the language of our audience or audiences? Because it could be different from one meeting to the next. So to that extent, I think this book is super practical, tactical, useful. I really enjoy it. It's a pretty quick read. You could pick it up in the middle and read a particular chapter, look for examples that bring it to life. It's not a long, dense academic thing by any stretch. And you can compare this type of a book with some of the other books we've reviewed and we've discussed that are really more about purpose, about what we need to thrive, about what vulnerability means, about empathic listening, and even about listening to our own tune within us. So this is much more tactical and really, really engaging and useful. I think it's a really nice balance, and it's a nice menu item on our menu of books here in this book club and podcast. The book's written by Chip Heath and Karla Starr. Chip Heath is a professor at Stanford School of Business. He and his brother have written a series of best-selling books, including The Power of Moments and Decisive and Made to Stick. And the co-author, Karla Starr, has written for a number of magazines. She's a science writer, an award-winning science writer. And her first book was called Can You Be Lucky? Why Some People Seem to Win More Often Than Others, which also was a very highly regarded book. So again, for me, I think this is about listening for ways to be more effective in our communication. The numbers do not speak for themselves. We need to speak for the numbers, and this book helps us do that. So there are some key principles in this book, one of which is to best communicate numbers, don't use them. Don't use numbers. Use metaphors, use comparisons, use round up, round down, group things together. And I'll give some specific examples of some of these tactics in just a minute. That's largely what this talk is about, those examples. Translate everything into instinctive human experience, something people can relate to. Marketing people understand this better than I do, certainly. And that's why these examples are really helpful, because there's examples of what does it mean to translate something into instinctive human experience. And the authors say, if you use math well, you've got a valuable skill. But if you can use it and make it clear, and what that means, it's clear to the audience member. So I'm converting the numbers into something that feels more clear, something they can see and something they can feel, not something that's obscure, something that's over their heads. And that's really a superpower, not just a skill. And if we think about how much time and energy is spent gathering, formulating the right numbers, the right equation, and then the right number and the right result, hallelujah, we've got this number that represents something statistically. How do we communicate it so that it really represents something meaningful to the audience? Because that may be something very different, and maybe something very different. So let's talk about a few techniques that the authors recommend, a few approaches. One is to use a perspective phrase. One of those phrases is something that I mentioned earlier with the first example about the economy of the state of California. To use and that's also a category jumper, because we're jumping from the economy of a state to the size of a country. We're jumping categories. But a perspective, say, for example, around, let me give another example. If you were to say, how big is Pakistan, for example? Somebody does a Google search, how big is Pakistan? The answer is Pakistan is 340,000 square miles. Okay, that's the statistic. A perspective phrase might be something like, that's about the size of 2 Californias. Now, for me, at least as an American familiar with the US map, that is something translatable to me. I don't know what 340,000 square miles is compared to what? It's a little bit like when I heard about some of the forest fires earlier this year here in the state of New Mexico. They're talking about the millions of acres that have been burned. It sounds like a big amount, but I really can't quantify it. Tell me how big it is compared to another state or a city or something like that. And it gives me something to really understand it. It provides perspective. That'll be an example of using a perspective phrase. Also, use vivid, meaningful messages, something that's meaningful to an audience. For example, here's the statistic. 97.5% of the world's water is salinated. That's only 2.5% that's fresh, right? And 99% of that 2.5% is trapped in glaciers and snowfields. And therefore, only 0.025% of the water on the globe is actually drinkable by humans and animals. Well, that really sounds like a small amount to me. It does. 0.025% of the water is drinkable. But what if you communicate it this way? Imagine a gallon jug filled with water with 3 ice cubes next to it. So 3 ice cubes next to a gallon jug. All of the water in the jug is salt water. The ice cubes are the only fresh water, and humans can only drink the drops that are melting off of the ice cubes. Whoa, that gives me something I can relate to. So again, a really interesting example of how do we convert something into something more vivid and meaningful. Another technique that the authors offer is localizing the message. And I do believe that marketing people understand this, good, effective communicators understand this. I didn't quite grasp it until I heard this example of how local health campaigns around the world communicated what social distancing means for COVID or something like that. And I know that the number that I heard most often is, or the figure is, keep 6 feet of space, right? And sometimes, whether it's on subway platforms or in airports, they'd have these little footprints on the ground that would mark it out for us. That's great. Then I don't have to think about what's 6 feet. I just put my feet on the little things on the ground. That's helpful. But think about ways that these examples of how different health campaigns, presumably through governments or health agencies, localized this thing about 6 feet. In Canada, they talked about one hockey stick, keep one hockey stick space. In Japan, they talked about one tatami mat. At the Ohio County Fair, they had a sign up that said, keep one alpaca apart. In France, they talked about keeping away 2 baguettes distance. Yes, I'm smiling as I think about this because I think it's really clever, but it's very relatable, right? If you're a kid who plays hockey and you're thinking, keep one hockey stick away, well, first of all, it's clearer to me. It's a little more memorable. It also perhaps becomes a little bit more engaging and a little bit more personal and less clinical as to keeping that type of a distance. So that would be one way to localize a message. Another approach is to convert abstract numbers into concrete objects. And the example that they provided here I thought was really quite interesting. I'll read that. So let's say, for example, that you, God forbid, need to go to the doctor, and the doctor needs to tell you the size of a tumor in your body. So what if your doctor tells you that your tumor is 3 centimeters? Okay, so a half an hour later, you may struggle to think, well, how big? What did he say, or what did she say? What did she tell me that was the size of this thing? I'm not sure. What's the number? And then, but what if alternatively the doctor said that the tumor is the size of a grape, or right, or for example, the amount of meat recommended as part of a healthy meal is 3 to 4 ounces. Right? I've heard a number like this before. But what if it was communicated to me this way? The amount of meat recommended as part of a healthy meal is 3 to 4 ounces, which looks about the same size as a deck of cards. This is something I can keep in mind when I think about, going for that second slab of barbecue. This is something that I can really visualize. It's a concrete object. Because it's so clear, it's going to be more memorable. So I'll remember grape if she tells me, God forbid, that there's a grape in there that shouldn't be there, as compared to something that's a certain number of centimeters. So good example of a way to convert into concrete objects. And there's another example of converting something into a concrete object having to do with something broader or societal figure. For example, the concentration of wealth in the United States. So the statistic is the wealthiest 1% of Americans own 31% of the wealth in the country. The top 10% owns around 70% of the wealth, and the bottom half, so half the US population owns around 2%. So to convert that to a concrete object would be, imagine an apartment building that has 10 units on each floor, 10 floors, 100 apartments in total. The richest 1% owns 31 apartments in the building. Together, the 10 wealthiest, well, let me do another way. The richest person owns 31 apartments. Together, the 10 wealthiest own 70 of the apartments. The poorest person shares ownership with everyone who's worth less than $100,000. If that's you, then you and 49 other people would need to share 2 apartments. That's what you've got. So it's a way of a concrete object. That really makes the number sink in, as opposed to some of these statistics about percentages. So another great example of converting an abstract number into a concrete example. Another strategy that they suggest, make the numbers personal. And this example is one that I can personally relate to because I remember it being shared with me when I entered law school. If you've had this experience of entering law school, maybe you've heard this as well. So to be told the first year dropout rate is 33% in law schools, and actually I want to be careful. I don't know if that's still true. When I was in law school, sometime close to the end of the last millennium, it was still a real number. It was communicated to me that way, but it was also communicated this way to our first year class sitting nervously in the first week of law school. Look to your left and look to your right. One of the 3 of you will not be here next fall. That gets our attention more than the statistic of 33%. These are people that I'm looking at, many of them who, of course, became good friends. So that makes it personal. Another strategy they suggest is to offer an encore. So give an example and then punctuate it even with something more. So let me share a very interesting example about the US diet and the impact on the environment. So a statistic about the amount of meat we consume in the United States might be useful for a public policy discussion around climate change or global warming. Was where a statistic like this comes from. If everyone in the world ate as much meat as Americans, the amount of land required to raise livestock would equal 138% of all of the habitable land on Earth. Let's communicate it another way. If everyone in the world ate as much meat as Americans, all habitable land on Earth would have to be used to raise livestock, and we'd still need more, an additional landmass as big as Africa and Australia combined. So there's a little oomph in using that, what they call an encore, in the example that's being shared. But then we're comparing just the statistics to specific references to parts of the globe, because I think it's useful because we can visualize it. It comes to life that much more. And one final useful approach that I think is most important to identify, and then I have some more depending on the time we have left, is to show things that you can't put into words. And this is a particularly, I think, poignant and just interesting way of communicating numbers. And this has to do with the way one company demonstrated how their procurement system was overspending on a whole bunch of different duplicative products. So they were buying things from different places at different prices in a very inefficient way. So somebody came to a meeting saying, we are wasting millions, perhaps tens of millions, on an inefficient procurement system. And here's a 9-tab spreadsheet that summarizes my findings. So it just has all these numbers in there with these different prices, et cetera. Instead, what he decided to do is he went to the meeting and said, I want to show you my collection of the 424 different gloves that our company is ordering now. And that represents just one minor product that we purchase. So he had an intern go down to pick up examples or one of each glove. So you got the statistic, we're ordering 424. Get an example of each one, bring it back to my office, put it into a box. And the intern got all the gloves with the price tags attached to them and put the gloves in a box. And when this man presented it to the senior audience, he dumped them onto the table. And you could see the 424 different gloves on the table. Some of them were identical looking pairs of gloves. One was $3 and something, one was $10 and something, and they're all spread on the table and you could see it. And it's like, this is what we're doing, and it led to, so it was a physical demonstration that was much more visceral and real, of course, than some spreadsheet where you're just looking at different numbers that seem to be, some are higher than the other. But to look at this way and appreciate it, and in that company, they called it the glove shrine. And they said people talked about the glove shrine for months. and they thought, well, this is what's happening with respect to gloves. Where else are we spending in this way, wildly inefficiently? Much more interesting than talking about, and memorable and useful and compelling than we're wasting X amount of money. How do you see it? How do you bring it to life? So a physical demonstration like that is also a really, really useful tool. So those would be some useful examples. I have some more approaches to share. I wonder if before I go to these additional approaches, we bring Zach on to see if you have any thoughts about this or any discussion points before I bring in some more examples.
I'm curious to see where you go with pie charts and stuff like that. I'm wondering if that's coming up. That was one little note that I got, because everyone loves a good pie chart. I feel like those are wonderful examples of numbers, but these are great. I mean, I'm taking notes. A lot of it just reminds me of just storytelling. How do you convert just a bunch of numbers to telling a great story, like you did with the Earth, with a day in the life of the Earth.
Right, the history of the Earth, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. And
I think.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, and the encores I think are interesting too. And to top it off, you're going to need Australia and Africa combined. It's really interesting.
I think it definitely relates to storytelling, and sometimes it is a story where you can, picture yourself doing this, like the example of what does 1 in a million really mean? You're going to the library, Harry Potter. You can visualize someone going to the library, or you can visualize yourself coming upon that jug of water with the 3 melting ice cubes. Could we see ourselves in this situation? But understanding, just like with storytelling, know your audience. What does your audience want to hear? What are they used to? What kind of stories do they prefer? And some of this is just as simple as knowing your audience, but some of these techniques about just illustrating the impact of certain things, the disparities of wealth. Wait a minute. So half of us in the country are crowded into 2 out of 100 apartments. Yeah, that's how that works.
Yeah, and I think that those visual images as well. You're talking about the grape, to for the size of cancer or something like that. I was thinking about this, that there's a memorization technique. Do you know about this? I don't know if I'll explain it exactly right, but people who are able to memorize like things very quickly, they usually attach images to
yes
them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're going to the supermarket, and they need to remember what they're need to buy at the supermarket, they'll say, I need bananas in a basket. And so they'll visualize the bananas and they'll put them in the basket. If I need, a steak, I think of a steak. And then I think of my grandmother who cooks great steaks. So I'm thinking I'm a grandmother with, so then I think of the basket and my grandmother, and it's really just creating stories around it. So it's not just an abstract list of things. You actually attaching meaning to them. So yeah.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think what this book aims to do, and I think it does it well, is it shows us ways that I can do that converting for you. So let me paint a picture of your grandmother. Well, that doesn't sound right, but let me paint a picture of something that would be memorable for you. So you don't have to do that equating with a memory exercise. I'll do it for you.
Yeah.
So say, for example, let me share a few more points if I can, unless you have something else to contribute right now.
No, great.
Okay, cool. So a few other things, like the authors talk about using the rule of one. So finding one thing, one sample, one prototype is another way of making statistics a little bit more, perhaps a lot more memorable. So for example, here's the statistic that might be used in a fast food. Actually, let me be more specific. Hold on. So a company that manufactures food or prepared foods has done a lot of research on who their typical customers are, with the intention of figuring out, who are they and how can we best reach them, and how might we modify our packaging to satisfy our typical customers. So the statistic is our median customer is 32 years old, married with kids. 93% of our customers work full time. Our typical customer has an average of 1.7 kids, with 1.3 under the age of 5. So chances are there'll be more than one, a little bit more than one child under the age of 5. Her top 3 reasons for buying our product are convenience, familiar flavor, and our products are not as bad nutritionally as some of our competitors. That's what our survey data reflects to us. So it's painting a statistical picture. Let's think about, let me paint a picture of a person. So here's the rule of one and the prototype in bringing these statistics to life. Our prototypical customer is a 32-year-old mom stopping by the store on her way home from work after picking up her kids from daycare. She's going down the aisle with a 2-year-old in the cart and a 4-year-old walking beside her. She has to grab the box she wants for dinner without the 4-year-old unloading the shelf closest to him. And when she tries to read the ingredients in fine print, the 2-year-old is slapping the box out of her hand. So really it's bringing this to life. After considering our prototypical customer, we recommend simplifying the package design so people can locate their favorite flavor faster, and increasing the font size of our nutritional information. So it's focusing on the nutritional information, the flavor, and the convenience, just as the statistics identified, but it's bringing it to life in such a greater way. By painting that type of a picture, that's what it can do. I also want to point out there's a particular small chapter in the book that recommends user-friendly numbers. And what does it mean by user-friendly numbers? It means simpler is better. Round off numbers. Don't say something cost $3.88 million. Say it cost $4 million. I mean, unless you're really dealing with something very specific, of course, that it needs to be for a particular technical audience or whatever. But generally speaking, rounding numbers is better. And concrete is better, rather than decimals, fractions, or percentages. Concrete items, concrete numbers are better than portions. So what they recommend is, if you have a really small number, it's like this tiny little thing, like the 0.025% of the water on Earth. Then multiply it a number of times so that it can become a whole number. And they give some examples of that in the book, which I won't cite here. So firm numbers are good, whole numbers are good. And with that in mind, with rounding in mind and whole concrete numbers in mind, defer to expertise. So that rule 1 and rule 2 can be trumped by expert knowledge. If you're dealing with experts who are familiar with those statistics, and the 0.025 means something to them that it would not be as meaningful to another audience, use the specific statistic. And the example they gave was, three places to the right of the decimal point may seem like some really obscure, 0.313, 0.278, maybe like, do we need to get into that level of detail? You're boring me. But if you're talking about batting averages, if you're an American baseball fan and you follow baseball and you understand that someone's hitting 323 versus 289, that means something to you. Don't round, because those specific fractions mean something to you. So I think that's useful in terms of thinking about user-friendly numbers. What's user-friendly to the audience is particularly impactful, even if generally we want to round our numbers and we want to stay away from fractions. They also recommend expressing probability in terms of things that you can count. So it could be you're expressing probability like with the Harry Potter book, where you're bringing something to life that way, going into the library, etc. What does 1 in a million mean? You could use that, but also things you can count. So for example, if the statistic is a single M&M candy has 4 calories, and a single Pringle potato chip has 10 calories, that's the raw number, right? But how do you count? How can I bring it more to life? with something I can count. For example, in order to burn off the calories in the single M&M, you'd have to walk 2 flights of stairs. And with respect to the Pringle, in order to burn off the calories in the single Pringle potato chip, you'd have to walk 176 yards or almost 2 football fields. This is something that I remember. So I may not want to hear the statistic if I'm marketing Pringles potato chips, but I probably ought to be aware of it. Another recommendation they have is use the clarity of common everyday items. So I would refer back to the example about the jug and the melting ice cubes. Very common everyday items that I can relate to helps me understand the statistic a little bit more. They speak a bit in the book about Florence Nightingale, the British nurse who helped save many lives after the working in hospitals in the Crimean War, mid-19th century, and how she used emotional numbers, really, really useful. So if the comparison was, the data size is that in the hospitals, they had 600 deaths for every 1,000 troops. Basically, they had a 60% death rate in British hospitals in the Crimean War. I may be slightly oversimplifying according to this book, so forgive me, but just if that's the working statistic, 60% deaths in the hospitals. What she said is, we had in the first 7 months of the Crimean campaign, from disease alone, a rate of mortality which exceeds that of the Great Plague of London. So she's communicating this information back to legislators and the House of Commons, House of Lords in London. They had been very familiar with the Great Plague of London that happens just a short amount of time before that. So in other words, she's bringing it home with an emotional thing because we all know people who died in the Great Plague of London, and she's converting something that happened way over there to something that maybe I can't relate to or I can't see, but she's relating it to something that we all lived through recently, an emotional number like that. Really, really useful. And they also recommend establishing a pattern or crystallizing a pattern and then breaking it. So, for example, Steve Jobs introduced the MacBook Air. I think they're talking about first generation MacBook Air. Actually, let me check the year for you, because you may be wondering what example is this talking about. Yeah, the original MacBook Air is what this book is saying. And he first began talking about Sony's laptop, the TZ, which was a very thin laptop. And he talked to his audience and he said, it's a really, really good laptop. It's very thin, right? On its wider side, when closed, it's only 1.2 inches. And on the more narrow side, when closed, it's only 0.8 inches, less than an inch. So it's a really good product. And that's really the market leader in terms of size. Now let's look at our product. He said our product is 0.76 inches at its widest, at its higher point when closed, and only 0.16 inches when closed. So he set this pattern of this is what a good laptop thinness, if you will, is by comparing it, by highlighting the competition, the Sony product, and then hitting you with, and this is where ours is. And then he showed a visual to the audience of how it compares. And then he came in with the kicker, which said, oh, and I want to point out something to you, that the thickest part of the MacBook Air is still thinner than the thinnest part of the Sony laptop. So there's your encore, perhaps at the end, in addition to a visual to help bring this to life. The other example of establishing a pattern and then breaking it might be this statistic about free trade and the number of Americans, the percentage of Americans that favor free trade. So here's the statistic. 59% of Americans said that growing trade ties between countries growing these ties is very good or somewhat good. 59%. But here's the way it was presented by this one journalist. Great majorities everywhere said that, actually the word is thumping majorities everywhere said that growing free trade ties between countries are very good or somewhat good. What are the percentages? 91% in China, 85% in Germany, 88% in Bulgaria, 87% in South Africa, 93% in Kenya. Of the 47 countries surveyed, the one that came in dead last was the United States at 59%. The only country within 10 percentage points of us was Egypt. So you set this pattern of 59%. That seems reasonably high, right? Then you compare it to pretty much everywhere else on Earth, or at least the 47 countries that were surveyed. So you're establishing some sort of a norm or a pattern, and then you're breaking it through some additional information or through a comparison. So that I think is a good illustration of this, again, this last point of establishing a pattern or a reference and then breaking it. So, I mean, whatever the quantity is that you're highlighting, it stands out more when you hold it up against the unspoken assumptions of the audience. What is the audience bringing to the table? And there's two other examples I'd share that I think are particularly impactful for me. And you may read this book, and some of the other statistics or communication of numbers may be more powerful for you. One of them harkens back to some research that was done a few years ago in the New York Times and elsewhere about how far our culture is from gender equity. And the statistic is that a very small percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. I think the number is actually 3.8%. But it doesn't list this here. I want to be careful. I'm pretty sure it was 3.8% at the time of this report. A very small percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Okay, I get it. I understand. I appreciate that. And how about if you could communicate it this way, which would be statistically accurate? Among Fortune 500 CEOs, there are more of them named James than there are women. So if you went into a room and there were all the CEOs of the Fortune 500 were in a room, there's 500 seats, and you said, how many are named James? More hands would go up than the number of women in the room. That's a perspective phrase, and for me anyway, extremely impactful. And finally, the last example I'd share in terms of reframing data in ways that it could be useful and start a compelling conversation. And this is what they would call, building a model that you can work with or a reference that you can work with. For example, like the apartment building or something that you can work with and really grasp. When workers in an organization were polled, only 37% said they have a clear understanding of what their organization is trying to achieve and why. Only 1 in 5 was enthusiastic about their team's goals and their organization's goals. And I hear numbers like this pretty regularly. Only 1 in 5 workers said they have a clear line of sight between their tasks and their teams and their organization's goals. Only 15% felt that their organization fully enables them to execute key goals. Only 20% fully trusted the organization they work for. I hear these numbers like, this is something to be concerned about. But what if you could translate it into something like this? Imagine if you were coaching 11 people on a soccer team. Only 4 of your players knew which goal they were aiming for. Only 2 of them cared about which goal was theirs. Only 2 players knew their position and how it related to the team overall. Only 2 players really trusted the coaches and team owners. Only 2 of them thought that they were given enough support to play their position as well as they knew they could. Most of your players would then likely be aimlessly kicking a ball around the field. I think this is a great example of making statistical data more visceral, more understandable. It shows the impact of the data. I mean, yes, could this potentially be used for manipulation or otherwise? Absolutely, it could. And it's a way of turning numbers into a position or into a conversation starter, as I see it. Ultimately, the book's about increasing our impact in communicating important numbers and starting a conversation, or advocating for a particular course of action. So in terms of conclusions in the book, I'd say there's a few. This is my opinion as to what's most important conclusions. Numbers have a place in our work. They just do. They're going to. They should. And we will all be more successful if we can translate the numbers so people can understand them better and engage with them. Like, what does this mean for me as somebody in this company? Just like, what does it mean for me as somebody in this culture to hear some statistic about health or the environment or something like that? And finally, this is a real key theme throughout the book. Communicating numbers with emotion is a powerful tool for influencing people to pay attention to the right things. So using emotion, and that's typically through examples that bring to life some of these numbers and what they mean for each of us. So I think those are the most important points of this book. I would definitely recommend it. And I think it's a great conversation starter for us in the world of executive coaching and leadership development, in culture change. What should we be paying attention to? How do we start those conversations? Just in the last few weeks, as I've been preparing for this, I've been speaking with several clients who want to influence their impact in meetings with certain audiences, et cetera. And among the things we're talking about are, well, what are the numbers you want to communicate? How could you bring it to life for your audience? And this book is full of really rich, useful examples for that, for how to do that. And it's a good read and a quick read. I'd recommend it. Thanks for listening. Zach, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, especially in this, what we're doing right now, a virtual, in a Zoom space and stuff, to just engage with people more by using these examples, using these stories. To hear a lot of numbers just kind of being spoken, even in your last, or one of your last examples about the team, when you get 20%, 30%, 15, and you just keep, I'm just trying to keep up. But then when you talk about the mess that's going to be going on the soccer field, absolutely, it's clear. Okay, yeah, and we're not in the same. I can see what the impact of those numbers mean. The real impact of them. So yeah, super important. And like I said, I think more important now when, you're not face to face with people and you are really trying to give them good visuals. When you have limited resources. Some would say on Zoom, you've got all the resources. You can show videos, you can do.
Well, yeah, but you know what? Let me just, forgive me for butting in here for 1 second here, but I was speaking with a client earlier today on the other side of the world, actually, this afternoon for me, in the morning, his time, and he was talking about eye contact as a way of influencing in meetings. And you can only do so much for eye contact when you're on Zoom. Yeah. Because let's say, for example, if I were an excellent presenter as I aspire to be, I could be looking at that green dot just unflinchingly and moving attention. I can't control what somebody on the other side who's in their kitchen working from home or whatever is doing. If they're looking at me, what their view is, if they're walking away, or even if they're tuning in and watching, it's not the same as the physical experience and the sensory experience of having eye contact. I mean, as my experience is, and I think this is a scientifically proven fact, you can feel somebody looking at you when they're behind you. Like, we're wired to do that. That don't happen on Zoom. No. Nobody knows which box I'm looking in when I'm looking on Zoom. I don't have a feeling that somebody's looking at me. We lose that dimension. So to that extent, I think, I'm not saying the numbers, communicating numbers effectively can make up for that. But I think it is a way, because we're doing this verbally and sometimes with visuals. We're doing this verbally, and it is a way of engaging people. Maybe it comes back to your storytelling.
Yeah,
I can still tell a compelling story via Zoom. Even via Zoom, I can tell a compelling story.
Absolutely. Or on the podcast, etc. I've been watching recently some clips from a movie that I think is really good um, at talking about numbers and dramatizing it to some extent. Is Moneyball. I don't know if
Mhm.
have you seen that?
I don't. It's on my list, but it's precisely because I want them to translate what some of these processes are into language I can understand. But please share more.
Well, no, it's just interesting. You know, they are the crux of it, and I haven't watched the whole movie. I was just watching some clips. Is they're realizing that sometimes the player, it's about buying. It's they're basically giving these guys
It's
salary.
about measuring the right things. I have seen it. The one I thought that you were talking about what's on my list is The Big Short, where they're really explaining about the financial crisis, things like that. But yeah, so with Moneyball, it's like, what are we valuing with respect to players? Are
Yeah.
we paying attention to the right things? Am I getting that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But The Big Short is a good with that too. The Big Short actually maybe is more to the point of this. The Big Short does have okay. Let's explain it in a hot tub with Margot Robbie, and maybe you'll understand what credit default
Right.
swaps mean if we give you something really interesting. I found The Big Short to be a really fun movie about all that about that financial crisis as well.
But
But
what was it about Moneyball that this brings forward for you?
well, I was just watching a scene about like what are we looking at? We're
Mm.
just looking at how many times he gets on base, and
Hmm.
that's the this one scene that you can find a clip of it. And they just keep saying, how many times does he get on base? And that
Hmm.
and you just realize, oh, okay, that's what we're looking for. We don't care how he gets on base. We don't care if he
Hmm.
can't hit. We don't care if he can't run. We don't care,
Hmm.
how old he is. How does he get on? How many times has he gotten on base? That's the
Hmm.
measurement that we're,
Hmm.
zeroing in on. Because if we can get a bunch of guys that can do that, then the guy that can really hit, he's going to really get us the points that we want.
Hmm.
That's the
Right.
important thing, not,
Right.
how many guys can really hit. But if they can't really get on base, then it doesn't matter. This is
Right. So if we're overemphasizing what somebody's batting average is, how many times they get clean hits or something, so their batting average is this hallowed number that we tend to overemphasize, as it
yeah,
compared to how many times do they walk, how many times do they get hit by a pitch, how many times, whatever, that matters in terms of scoring runs, and scoring runs is about winning games.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I
So
thought that was
yeah,
just interesting in that scene. At the
yeah,
end, I know nothing about baseball. I don't. You
hmm,
could tell me a batting average. You tell me two, and I wouldn't. I mean, I'd say the higher one's probably better, but I wouldn't know
right,
if
right,
either's are good. But that I was watching that scene, and I was like, because they kept saying he gets on base. That's the that's what we need to know. Yeah. So
hmm.
anyway, um, yeah, very cool book. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah. So the encouragement here is look for ways that this book can help us bring numbers to life, especially I think if we find ourselves, I think we all do at times, like, okay, I've got this number. Like, what do I do with it? How do I communicate it? How do I help this audience and to really feel it and put it on and walk around in it? And I think we're all doing that at some important points, and it helps our decisions. Whether it's how much do I want to borrow some money, and if so, how much, and what does it represent, either compared to something else or compared to my overall spending or something like that. There's just and I can envision teams, and I've spoken with some leaders about this already. I can envision teams, sitting around talking about a statistic that's important for them, saying, how else can we describe this? Or how else can we represent this number in terms of the opportunity cost? What else could we be doing with this investment? Or what else could we be doing with the time it's going to take to accomplish this? Now that we've calculated how much time it's going to take, we could say, well, here are the other things we could be doing. And then going back to some key customer and saying, what would you prefer that we do? But you just translating the numbers into something that's meaningful. It is a superpower, I think, if we can do it well.
Yeah.